There's a line that runs across the top of the North American continent. It stretches for 5,525 miles. It cuts through forests and lakes, it runs across the golden prairies, and over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. It ends in the cold waters of the Pacific Ocean. We call it the border. For generations, we have been told a story about this line. We are told it is the longest undefended border in the world. We are told it represents a friendship that is unique in history. The United States and Canada, neighbors, partners, allies, two nations that are like siblings sharing the same house. We see the Peace Arch in Washington State. We see the bridges where cars flow freely. We see the trade deals and the cultural exchange. But history is a curtain. And sometimes, if you pull back that curtain, you see something that makes your blood run cold. Imagine if I told you that beneath the surface of this friendship, there was a plan to destroy it. Imagine if I told you that the United States military, the same military that liberated Europe and fights for democracy, spent decades planning a massive surprise attack on Canada. This was not a theoretical exercise. This was not a doodle on a napkin. This was a fully funded, fully authorized operational guide. It had troop movements. It had bombing targets. It had supply lines. It even had a budget for chemical weapons. The goal was not just to defeat the Canadian Army. The goal was to wipe the Dominion of Canada off the map, to seize its cities, to occupy its ports, and to turn the Great White North into the 51st state by force. This is the story of War Plan Red. This is the story of the time the United States prepared to invade its best friend. To understand this story, we have to forget the world we live in today. We have to forget NATO. We have to forget the United Nations. We have to forget the idea that the West is one big happy family. We have to go back to the 1920s and the 1930s. The First World War was over. The trenches of Europe had been filled in. The world was trying to rebuild. The United States had emerged from the war as a global superpower. Its factories were humming. Its banks were full of gold. Its navy was growing. But across the Atlantic Ocean, there was a rival, the British Empire. Today, we think of Britain and America as the closest of allies, the special relationship. But in the 1920s, they were rivals. They were competitors. Britain was the old master of the world. It controlled the seas. It controlled trade. It controlled a quarter of the globe. The United States was the new challenger. It wanted to control the seas. It wanted to control trade. Tension was building. There were disputes over oil rights in the Middle East. There were disputes over rubber in Asia. There were disputes over the repayment of war debts. Britain owed America billions of dollars, and they didn't want to pay it back. The admirals in Washington and the admirals in London looked at each other with suspicion. They started to build bigger battleships. They started to count their cannons. And in the basement of the State, War, and Navy building in Washington, D.C., a group of men sat down to answer a terrifying question. If war breaks out between the United States and Britain, how do we win? They knew they couldn't invade England. It was too far away. The British Royal Navy was too strong. They couldn't fight a war in the Atlantic Ocean. So they looked for a weakness. They looked for a place where the British Empire was vulnerable, a place where the British flag flew, but where the British Navy couldn't save them. They looked north. They looked at Canada. In the eyes of the American war planners, Canada was not a friendly neighbor. It was a hostage. It was a British dominion. It was loyal to the crown. If Britain went to war with America, Canada would be legally obligated to join the fight. Canada would be the launching pad for British attacks on American cities. So the planners decided that the best defense was a good offense. In 1930, the War Department approved the final version of the document. It was stamped top secret. Its official title was Joint Army and Navy Basic War Plan Red. In this plan, every country was given a color code. The United States was blue. Great Britain was red. Germany was black. Japan was orange. And Canada. Canada was given the code name Crimson. The Crimson Plan was not a plan for a fair fight. It was a plan for a blitzkrieg. The strategists in Washington knew that they had to move fast. They had to knock Canada out of the war before Britain could send reinforcements across the ocean. They divided Canada into theaters of war. They identified the key targets. They calculated exactly how many men and how many bullets it would take to crush the Canadian resistance. Let's look at the map of the invasion. The plan called for a multi-pronged attack, a simultaneous strike on 5 different fronts. It was designed to slice Canada into pieces so that the provinces couldn't help each other. The first target was Nova Scotia. The American planners knew that Halifax was the most dangerous city in Canada. It was the headquarters of the Royal Canadian Navy. It was the only major port on the east coast that didn't freeze in the winter. It was the gateway for British troops. So the plan called for a massive amphibious assault on Halifax. The U.S. Navy would steam out of Boston and New York. They would bombard the coast. Then 25,000 American Marines would storm the beaches near Halifax. Their orders were clear: seize the port, destroy the docks, cut the telegraph cables. And there was a chilling detail in the appendix of the plan. The American generals were worried that the Canadians would fight hard for Halifax. They were worried about trench warfare, so they recommended the use of chemical warfare. The document explicitly authorized the use of poison gas against the Canadian defenders in Nova Scotia. Think about that for a second. This was 8 years after the world had outlawed chemical weapons in the Geneva Protocol. The United States had signed that protocol, but the planners wrote that in a war of survival treaties didn't matter. They were willing to gas the citizens of Halifax to secure the port. The second target was Montreal. Montreal was the heart of Canada. It was the financial capital. It was the transportation hub. All the railroads and all the shipping on the St. Lawrence River went through Montreal. If you controlled Montreal, you controlled the flow of food and fuel to the rest of the country. The plan called for an army to march north from Vermont and New York. They would follow the path of the Hudson River. They would smash through the border defenses at Rouse's Point. They estimated they could reach Montreal in 3 days. Once they took the bridges over the St. Lawrence River, Canada would be cut in half. The Atlantic provinces would be isolated from Ontario in the west. The third target was the Great Lakes. This was the industrial heartland. Toronto, Hamilton, Buffalo, Detroit. The plan called for a massive invasion across the Niagara River. American troops would seize the hydroelectric power plants at Niagara Falls. This would turn off the lights in Ontario. Then they would march on Toronto. But the planners had a surprise for Toronto. They knew that a ground invasion would be slow, so they planned an air war. In the 1930s, aviation was just beginning to mature. But the American military was already thinking about strategic bombing. They identified the key factories in Toronto, the rail yards, the government buildings. They planned to launch bombers from airfields in New York and Michigan. They would fly over the lake and rain destruction on the Canadian cities. The fourth target was the prairies. Winnipeg was the target here. It was the rail junction that connected east and west. If you cut the rail line at Winnipeg, you starved Vancouver. The plan called for a mechanized column to drive north from North Dakota. There were no natural defenses on the prairies. It was flat open ground, perfect for tanks, perfect for a fast-moving invasion force. The fifth target was Vancouver. On the west coast, the target was the Royal Navy base at Esquimalt on Vancouver Island. The U.S. Navy would blockade the Strait of Juan de Fuca. They would starve the city of Vancouver into submission. They would seize the port to prevent the British from landing troops from Asia or Australia. The scope of War Plan Red was breathtaking. It was total war. It assumed that the Canadian Army would be overwhelmed. In 1930, the Canadian Army was tiny. It had only about 4,000 regular soldiers. It was a militia force. The United States Army was also small compared to Europe, but it had a massive reserve. It had millions of men who could be drafted. It had the industrial might of Detroit and Pittsburgh. The planners calculated that they could conquer the major cities of Canada within 30 days. But they didn't just plan for the invasion, they planned for the occupation. The document discussed what to do with the Canadian government. It discussed how to manage the civilian population. It suggested that the United States should not return the territory after the war. The planners believed that the geography of North America destined it to be one single nation. They saw the invasion as an opportunity to fix the mistake of 1776, to finally unite the continent under the stars and stripes. They planned to abolish the Canadian provinces. They would establish military territories. They would impose American law. They would seize the banks and the resources. It was a blueprint for annexation. Now you might be thinking that this was just a paper exercise, that it was just some bored colonels in a basement playing games. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The United States government spent millions of dollars preparing for this war. In 1935, the U.S. Congress passed the Wilcox Air Base Act. This was a bill to build new air bases across the United States. It was sold to the public as a jobs program during the Great Depression. But if you look at where the bases were built, a pattern emerges. They built a massive air base in Festive, Michigan. They built one in New York. They built one in the Pacific Northwest. These bases were located perfectly to strike Canadian targets. There was a scandal when the testimony from the congressional hearings leaked. A U.S. general named Frank Andrews testified before a secret committee. He pointed to a map. He explained that these new bases were necessary to project air power over the industrial triangle of Ontario. He was talking about bombing Toronto. The Canadian government saw this. They read the newspapers. They knew what the Americans were doing. And this brings us to the other side of the line. What was Canada doing while the Americans were measuring them for a coffin? Did they know? Did they care? The answer is yes, they knew. They were terrified. Canada in the 1920s was a nation with a complex about its neighbor. They looked south and they saw a giant that was loud and rich and heavily armed. The Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King was a strange man. He was obsessed with the spirit world. He held seances to talk to his dead mother and his dead dog. But he was also a shrewd politician. He knew that Canada could not defeat the United States in a fair fight. If the Americans invaded, Canada would lose. That was a mathematical certainty, but that didn't mean they were going to roll over. In a small office in Ottawa, there was a man named James Sutherland Brown. Everyone called him Buster. Buster Brown was the director of military operations and intelligence for the Canadian Army. He was a veteran of the First World War. He was a man with a thick mustache and a deep suspicion of Yankees. Buster Brown believed that war with the United States was inevitable. He believed that the Americans were aggressive and imperialist. So years before the Americans' finished war plan, Red Buster Brown wrote his own plan. It was called Defense Scheme Number 1. If War Plan Red was a sledgehammer, Defense Scheme Number 1 was a suicide vest. Buster Brown knew that the Canadian Army was too small to defend the border. If they sat in trenches and waited, they would be flanked and destroyed. So his plan was radical. He planned to invade the United States first. It sounds insane. A country of 10 million people invading a country of 120 million. But Buster Brown's logic was based on time. He knew that the American army was slow to mobilize. It would take weeks for the U.S. to gather its tanks and its artillery. Brown planned to use flying columns. These were fast-moving units of cavalry and infantry supported by trucks. The moment war was declared, the Canadian Army would charge south across the border. The troops from Vancouver would drive south and seize Seattle and Portland. They would destroy the bridges and the ports. The troops from the prairies would drive south towards Minneapolis. The troops from Quebec would drive south towards Albany. The goal was not to conquer America. Buster Brown wasn't crazy. He knew he couldn't hold Seattle. The goal was chaos. He wanted to fight the war on American soil. He wanted to blow up American bridges. He wanted to burn American supplies. He wanted to buy time. He calculated that if he could disrupt the American mobilization for 2 or 3 weeks, it might give the British Empire enough time to send the Royal Navy across the Atlantic. It was a desperate plan. It was a plan born of fear. Buster Brown spent his weekends driving across the border in civilian clothes. He was a spy in a Ford Model T. He would drive to Vermont and New York. He would stop at gas stations and diners. He would take notes on the condition of the roads. He would sketch the bridges. He would look for good places to set up machine gun nests. He noted where the Americans got their water. He noted where the telephone lines ran. He was casing the joint. Imagine this Canadian general sitting in a diner in upstate New York, eating a burger, looking at the locals, and thinking about how he would blow up the road they were driving on. It shows you how deep the suspicion went. Defense Scheme Number 1 was top secret. Only a handful of people in Ottawa knew it existed. When the politicians eventually found out about it years later, they were horrified. They ordered the plans to be burned. But Buster Brown didn't burn them. He kept them, just in case. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, there were moments when it looked like these plans might actually be used. In 1927, there was a naval conference in Geneva. The U.S. and Britain met to discuss limiting the size of their navies. The conference collapsed in anger. The British refused to accept American equality on the seas. The Americans accused the British of arrogance. The press on both sides went wild. Newspapers in Chicago ran headlines calling for war with Britain. They said it was time to kick the king out of North America. In Ottawa, the politicians watched with dread. Then came the Great Depression. Economic collapse often leads to war. As the American economy crumbled, there was a fear that the U.S. might lash out, that they might look for a distraction. There was a trade war. The U.S. passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising taxes on Canadian goods. Canada retaliated. Trade stopped. The border became a barrier. And in the middle of this tension, a famous aviator entered the story. Charles Lindbergh, the Lucky Lindy, the man who flew across the Atlantic. He was an American hero, but he was also working for the U.S. military. In the 1930s, Lindbergh flew secret missions over Canada. He claimed he was looking for new commercial air routes. He said he was just exploring. But later declassified documents suggest he was gathering intelligence. He was photographing the coastline of Hudson Bay. He was looking for landing sites for American bombers. He reported back to the U.S. Army Air Corps. He told them that the Canadian defenses were weak. He told them that the terrain was difficult but passable. The most famous man in the world was scouting the invasion of the neighbor. So we have the plans. We have the motive. We have the means. Why didn't it happen? Why are we not living in the United States of North America today? Why is Ottawa still a capital city and not a regional outpost? History often turns on small things, a chance meeting, a change of heart, a common enemy. But before we get to the resolution, we have to walk through the nightmare. We have to imagine what would have happened if the order had been given. Let's play out the scenario of War Plan Red. Let's imagine it is June 1935. A trade dispute between London and Washington escalates. A British cruiser fires a warning shot at an American merchant ship in the Caribbean. The American captain panics and returns fire. People die. The headlines scream for revenge. The president is under pressure. He meets with his generals. They pull the red folder from the safe. The order goes out. Code Crimson. At dawn on a Tuesday morning, the residents of Niagara Falls wake up to the sound of artillery. American shells slam into the Canadian power stations. The sky turns black with smoke. Thousands of troops pour across the Rainbow Bridge. The Canadian militia tries to hold the line, but they are outgunned 10-1. In Vancouver, the U.S. Pacific Fleet appears on the horizon. The battleships USS Texas and USS New York open fire. 14-inch shells rain down on the city. The docks explode. In the prairies, a column of tanks rolls across the border at Emerson. They crush the fences. They drive north towards Winnipeg, kicking up dust. The farmers watch in stunned silence. And in the skies above Toronto, the bombers arrive. They are primitive biplanes by modern standards, but they carry incendiary bombs. They target the rail yards. They target the factories. Fires start to burn in downtown Toronto. The wooden buildings catch quickly. The Canadian Prime Minister declares a state of war. He radios London for help. Buster Brown activates Defense Scheme Number 1. Canadian troops in Quebec rush south. They blow up the bridges leading to New York. They ambush an American supply convoy. For a few weeks, there is chaos. The border is a bleeding wound. North America is tearing itself apart. Thousands of civilians are killed. Refugees clog the roads heading north into the wilderness. The British Navy sets sail from Scapa Flow, but they are weeks away. And the American submarines are waiting in the Atlantic. This is the war that almost was. This is the timeline we narrowly avoided. It feels like science fiction, but it is historical fact. The only reason it feels impossible to us is because we know the ending. We know that Hitler rose in Germany. We know that Japan rose in the Pacific. We know that a greater danger forced Britain and America to stop looking at each other and start looking at the true enemy. But in 1930, Hitler was just a noisy politician in Munich. The real threat was the brother across the border. The story of War Plan Red is a lesson in the fragility of peace. It teaches us that nations do not have friends. They have interests. And when those interests collide, even the oldest friendships can be written off in a document stamped top secret. But the story doesn't end with the drafting of the plan. The true horror is in the details of how they planned to govern the conquered land. The Americans didn't just want to defeat Canada, they wanted to erase it. When an army invades a country, they usually have a plan for the day after. They plan to install a new government or set up a puppet regime. But they usually leave the country on the map. War Plan Red was different. The planners in Washington did not see Canada as a real country. They saw it as a mistake of geography. They saw it as a lost colony that had failed to join the Revolution of 1776. So their plan for the occupation was not about administration. It was about assimilation. The secret appendix of the plan discussed the political future of the North. It suggested that once the Canadian Army was defeated, the United States should not sign a peace treaty with Ottawa. Instead, they should dissolve the Canadian government entirely. They planned to take the provinces and turn them into U.S. territories. Quebec would present a problem. The planners knew that the French-speaking population was distinct. They worried about an insurgency in the forests of Quebec, so they discussed breaking Quebec up. They considered banning the French language in official business to force integration. It was a strategy of cultural erasure. But the real prize was not the culture. It was the resources. In the 1930s, war was becoming a battle of industry. To build tanks and battleships, you needed steel. To make steel hard enough for armor, you needed nickel. And where was the nickel? 90% of the world's supply of nickel was in one place, Sudbury, Ontario. The war plan. Red documents circled Sudbury in red ink. It was perhaps the most strategic target on the entire continent. If Germany or Japan wanted to build a modern army, they needed Canadian nickel. If the United States wanted to rule the world, they needed to control that supply. The plan called for a special task force to bypass the cities and race directly to Sudbury. Their orders were to seize the mines intact. If the Canadians tried to sabotage the mines, the Americans were authorized to execute the saboteurs. It was a gangster move. It was a heist disguised as a war. And they didn't just want the nickel. They want the wheat. The prairies of Canada produced enough grain to feed the British Empire. The American plan was to divert that food south. They calculated that by seizing the Canadian harvest, they could starve Britain into submission without ever landing a soldier in England. They would use Canada as a weapon against its own mother country. Now you might wonder, how serious were they really? Was this just some low-level bureaucrats typing on typewriters? No, it went to the very top. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is remembered as a friend of Canada. He liked to vacation on Campobello Island in New Brunswick. He spoke French. He seemed like a good neighbor. But Roosevelt was a realist. In 1935, the United States government built 3 secret airfields near the Canadian border. One was in Great Falls, Montana. One was in Bismarck, North Dakota. One was in northern Maine. The government told the public these were civilian airports. They said they were for mail planes. But later investigations revealed a strange detail. The runways on these airports were incredibly long, much longer than a mail plane needed. They were paved with heavy-duty concrete. They were built for heavy bombers. The only target within range of a heavy bomber flying from northern Maine was the cities of eastern Canada. The Canadian military intelligence spotted this. Buster Brown, the spy general, was watching. He sent a report to Ottawa. He said the Americans are building jumping-off points. He warned that the U.S. Army was positioning itself for a strike. But the Canadian politicians were paralyzed. They couldn't afford to anger the Americans. Canada was broke during the Depression. They needed American trade. So they stayed silent. They smiled and shook hands while the concrete dried on the runways aimed at their homes. And then there was the Lindbergh connection. We mentioned Charles Lindbergh earlier. His role in this shadow war is one of the most controversial chapters in aviation history. Lindbergh was an isolationist. He believed that America should stay out of European wars, but he also believed in American dominance of the Western Hemisphere. In the early 1930s, he made several flights over the Hudson Bay region. The press covered it as an adventure, the brave lone eagle exploring the wilderness. But Lindbergh was taking photos. He was mapping the inlets. The U.S. War Department was terrified that the British Royal Navy might try to land a secret invasion force in Hudson Bay and march south to attack the American Midwest. It sounds paranoid today, but back then it was a serious concern. Lindbergh's mission was to find the landing spots before the British did. He reported that the bay was ice-free for only a few months a year, but that it was a viable route for an invasion. Based on his intelligence, the U.S. Army updated War Plan Red. They added a contingency for a northern front. They planned to bomb the ports of Churchill and Moosonee to deny the British a foothold. So the most famous celebrity of the era was effectively an agent of the invasion plan. But history is full of twists. And the biggest twist in this story is how the plan died. It wasn't killed by a peace treaty. It wasn't killed by a change of heart. It was killed by Adolf Hitler. By the late 1930s, the world was darkening. Germany was rearming. Japan was invading China. The threat of fascism was growing. President Roosevelt looked at the map again, and he realized something fundamental. He realized that if Britain fell to the Nazis, the United States would be alone. The Royal Navy, which had been the rival, would be gone. The Atlantic Ocean would be open to German U-boats. Roosevelt realized he needed Britain, and he needed Canada. The calculus shifted overnight. Canada stopped being a hostage and started being a shield. The Americans realized that if Germany attacked North America, they would land in Canada first. They would attack Newfoundland or Nova Scotia. So suddenly the United States didn't want to conquer Canada. They wanted to protect Canada. In 1938, Roosevelt traveled to Kingston, Ontario. He stood on a bridge with a Canadian Prime Minister, and he made a historic promise. He said, "I give to you assurance that the people of the United States will not stand idly by if domination of Canadian soil is threatened by any other empire." The crowd cheered. They thought he was being friendly. But if you listen closely to the words, he was also asserting control. He was saying that Canada was now under the American umbrella, whether they liked it or not. War Plan Red was shelved, the color codes were retired. The focus shifted to the Rainbow Plans, which were plans for fighting Germany and Japan. During World War II, Canada and the U.S. became the closest of allies. They built the Alaska Highway together, they fought in Normandy together, they integrated their economies. It seemed like the nightmare was over, but secrets have a way of surfacing. For decades, War Plan Red sat in a dusty box in the National Archives in Washington. It was classified. Nobody looked at it. Then, in 1974, a Canadian reporter discovered it. The plan had been declassified, largely by accident. The archivists were moving old files, and they stamped it open. The reporter couldn't believe his eyes. He read the plans for the gas attacks on Halifax. He read the plans to seize the nickel mines. He read the plans to dissolve the government. He published the story. The reaction in Canada was shock. The headline screaming, "U.S. plan to invade Canada," appeared on the front pages. People were outraged. They felt betrayed. They asked how their best friend could have plotted their murder. But the reaction in the United States was different. It was mostly laughter. The American press treated it as a joke. They made fun of it. They said, who would want to invade Canada anyway? It's too cold. This reaction actually made the Canadians even angrier. It showed that the Americans didn't take Canada seriously as a sovereign nation. But military historians looked at the plan, and they didn't laugh. They saw how detailed it was. They saw how much money had been spent. They realized that this was not a joke. It was the policy of the United States government for 20 years. And this raises a disturbing question. Does the plan still exist? Officially, War Plan Red was canceled in 1939. But nations always have plans. The job of a general is to plan for the unthinkable. Today, the United States and Canada are integrated into NORAD. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, the U.S. Air Force, effectively controls the skies over Canada. There's a document called the Civil Assistance Plan. It was signed in 2008. It allows U.S. troops to enter Canada in the event of a civil emergency, like a natural disaster or a terrorist attack. Conspiracy theorists look at this document and they see a shadow of War Plan Red. They ask, what defines an emergency? Who decides when the troops go in? Who decides when they leave? If the Canadian government collapsed or if Canada turned hostile, would the U.S. military hesitate to secure the border? Probably not. The logic of 1930 is still the logic of today. A superpower cannot tolerate a threat on its border. Just look at what happens in other parts of the world. Look at Ukraine. Look at Taiwan. Geography dictates destiny. Canada is lucky. It shares a continent with a superpower that is a democracy and a trade partner. But luck is not the same as security. The story of War Plan Red is a reminder that the longest undefended border in the world is only undefended because one side decides to leave it that way. If that decision ever changes, the border is just a line in the dirt. Let's look deeper at the legacy of the secret. It explains a lot about the Canadian psyche. Canadians often define themselves by not being American. There's a low-level anxiety in the Canadian culture, a fear of being swallowed up. This anxiety comes from history. It comes from the invasions of 1812. It comes from the Fenian raids. And subconsciously, it comes from the knowledge that the giant next door could crush them at any moment. This is why Canada fights so hard for international law. This is why Canada loves the United Nations. Small countries need laws to protect them. Big countries don't need laws because they have tanks. When the US ignored the UN to invade Iraq, it terrified the Canadian establishment. It reminded them that when the chips are down, Washington does what Washington wants. And what about the other side? What about Buster Brown and his Suicide Squad? James Sutherland Brown. The man who planned to invade the US died before the Second World War. He never saw his plan activated, but his spirit lives on in a strange way. The idea that Canada needs to be able to disrupt the US to survive is still there. But today, the weapons are not flying columns of cavalry. Today, the weapons are electricity and water. Canada supplies a huge amount of the electricity that powers New York and New England. Canada supplies the oil that powers the Midwest. If a war ever happened today, Canada wouldn't need to invade. They would just need to turn off the tap. But of course, the US would never let that happen. They would seize the dams and the pipelines within hours. So we are back to the beginning. War Plan Red is a ghost story. It haunts the archives. It reminds us that the world is a dangerous place. It reminds us that alliances are temporary. It reminds us of the chemical weapons that were marked for Halifax. Imagine the citizens of that port city going about their day, not knowing that a few hundred miles south there were warehouses full of gas canisters with their name on them. It is a chilling thought. But there is a positive way to look at it too. The fact that War Plan Red was never used is a triumph of diplomacy. It is a triumph of common sense. The US and Canada managed to overcome their rivalry. They managed to build a relationship based on trade instead of conquest. They proved that two nations can share a continent without killing each other. That is a rare thing in human history. Usually neighbors fight. France and Germany fought for centuries. China and Japan fought. North America is an anomaly. It is a zone of peace. But peace is hard work. It requires constant maintenance. When trade disputes arise over lumber or milk or steel tensions flare up. When politicians use nationalist rhetoric, the old suspicions return. We should never take the border for granted. We should remember the red arrows on the map. We should remember the bombers on the runways in Maine. We should remember that the only thing standing between peace and War Plan Red is the will of the people to stay friends. The file is closed now. The paper is yellowing. The ink is fading. But the geography hasn't changed. The nickel is still in Sudbury. The wheat is still on the prairies. The ports are still in Halifax and Vancouver. And the superpower is still to the south. History is a sleeping dog. It is usually best not to wake it up. But we must know where it sleeps. We must know that for one brief, terrifying moment in the 20th century, the order was almost given. The order to erase the line. The order to make the map all one color. Blue. This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.